Kant, Deontology, and the Categorical Imperative. Immanuel Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. He was born in Königsberg, Prussia, and his entire life he never travels more than 30 miles from the place that he was born. I mention this for two reasons. First, because I think it's ironically humorous that this guy who never left his own backyard, one of the things that he taught at the university was anthropology, in which he professed to know everything there was to know about the world, even though he'd never left his backyard. So I think that's kind of ironic. The other reason I mention it, though, is the fact that if Kant's ethics has a problem, if it has a basic flaw, I think this is where that flaw is going to come from. Because Kant firmly believes that every individual, no matter who they are, is going to think and reason in exactly the same way. About 100 years ago, there was a sociologist, anthropologist called Benjamin Whorf, and he developed what's called the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And this tells us that the language that a person speaks is going to have a bearing upon the way that a person thinks and processes information, things of that nature. So it's highly doubtful that people born in different cultures are going to think and reason in exactly the same way that we do. Maybe had Kant actually seen some of the world, he would have been a little bit more open to that possibility. But really, his ethics hinges upon the fact that if we're taught how to use our rational capacity properly, then everyone will come to exactly the same conclusion with regards to what's right and what's wrong. Now, Kant is a very bright, very intelligent individual. He attends the university at Königsberg, and when he graduates with 5 degrees. He has degrees in philosophy, theology, medicine, physics, and mathematics. And he begins teaching almost immediately there at the University of Königsberg, and he remains there until about 1797, when poor health forces him into retirement, and he dies a few years later in 1804. Kant is considered by many to be the most important and most influential of all philosophers in the modern period. There are entire college courses devoted to just parts of his work. So he is a very influential fellow. Now, as far as his writings go, he begins writing almost immediately, but the stuff that we remember him for is what he writes in the last 20-25 years of his life, during what's called the critical period. During the critical period, he writes 3 critiques: the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. In addition, he writes some other works, one very important one that we're going to be looking at here, called The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. These writings are really going to influence the next 200 years of philosophy. And Kant is very influential as an ethicist, so that's why we're going to be focusing in on this. Now, as far as the critique of pure reason goes, amongst other things, he talks about the workings of the human mind, and that's going to be important because he wants to get back to the old Aristotelian way of looking at things, and recognizing that reason is our primary tool of ethics. The practical reason, critique of practical reason, is probably his most mature work on ethics, but this foundation of the metaphysics of morals is most likely the most read of all of his works, partially because it's only about 50 pages long. So it doesn't give you a lot of in-depth, but it gives you the core concepts, the core ideas. Kant makes the statement that Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. And what that means is, I said his writing was pretty mundane, pretty ordinary in the beginning. But in the 1770s, he read the work of David Hume. And he says, is this what people are really thinking about? Is this what passes for philosophy now? I have to do something to correct people and put them back on the path. Hume, as you recall from the last lecture, says that morality was about sentiment and emotion. It's a very subjective thing. And Kant says wrong. Morality is about reason. It's about logic. It's about making the rational choice. And it is absolute, not subjective. Kant's ethics is called Deontology. Deontology is the ethics of duty. We act from a sense of duty, from a moral obligation, not because we feel like it. Okay, we've got the image there of the guy helping the proverbial old lady across the street. And we see somebody doing that and we think, well, that's great. That's a kind, generous action. That's wonderful that he's willing to do this. And it is. It's a nice act. But Kant would say that if it's a moral duty, then that means you don't just do it now when you feel like it and have the time, but you do it any time that situation arises. If you're running late for work, you still stop and help the little old lady across the street if it's a moral duty. Because that's what dictates morality, is duty. If you act in accordance with that duty, you're acting correctly. And if you act contrary to that duty, you're acting incorrectly. Every human being is born with what Kant calls a good will. And he says that good will is the only thing that is good in and of itself without reference to anything else. And it's our job to protect that good will and to keep it from deviating into an evil will. And we do that by obedience to our moral duties. To help us understand this, Kant offers three propositions. The first proposition says, to have moral worth, an action must stem from duty. So as we were saying a moment ago, it's not about what you feel like or what you think might be nice or anything else. It's about what is your moral duty. As an example, let's suppose that we go back in time and we're traveling to Königsberg to visit Kant, and we stop across at this tavern for the night. Now, during Kant's time, it was commonplace that when you went into a tavern looking for a room, that they would have fixed prices. These prices were set by the town councils so that people didn't have to go searching around. If you wanted a public room, the price was set. Okay? Public rooms were another matter, but private, it should be the same no matter who you are, no matter where you went. So, let's say its signpost says 10 Pfennig for the night. So we pay our 10 Pfennig and we get the room. We stand there, we talk to the landlord for a while, and he tells us about how bad things have been lately and how he's not been able to make the ends meet and, the whole sob story. All of a sudden we get this rich-looking carriage that pulls up, regal-looking, well-dressed gentleman gets out of it, his manservant hands down his luggage. The landlord takes one look at this guy and thinks, here's my chance. And so when the man comes in asking for a room, now I don't know why he's asking for a public room when he can obviously afford a private one, but let's say he comes in, he's asking for a public room, and the landlord says, okay, here's my chance. And he starts weaving him a story about how difficult it's going to be to get him in. And anyway, I can do it, but it's going to cost you 50 Pfennig for the night. We're going to charge him 5 times as much as the set rate. It should come as no surprise to anyone out there that Kant would say that this is morally wrong. His duty is to charge that man the same rate that he charges everyone else. No matter who you are, the rate is 10 Pfennig a night for that public room. Not to say, oh, this guy looks like he can afford it, therefore I'm going to charge more. That's morally wrong. Now, after a while, we stand there talking with the landlord, and in walks this scruffy beggar. He's looking really down on his luck, and looking for a place to stay for the night, maybe a meal. And the landlord takes pity on him and says, yeah, all right, you've only got 3 pfennig to your name. I'll let you have the room for that. For most people, that would be perceived as a kind and generous action. But for Kant, it's every bit as bad as what was done a moment before, because your duty is to charge everyone the same. When you give the room to that pauper for 3 pfennig, you're taking advantage of everybody else that's paying the fixed and going rate. Now that doesn't mean that you have to be a heartless individual. It's good to show compassion and concern for your fellow man. So if you want to give him the opportunity to work off the other 7, that's fine. But morally, what you cannot do, according to Kant, is to let him have the room for less than anybody else is going to pay. Morality means obedience to duty. And so when you treat everybody exactly the same, that's morally right. When you draw distinctions and treat people differently, that's morally wrong. The second proposition says it's the intention of obeying the duty that counts, not the consequences. So Kant's ethics is what we'd call a non-consequentialist view of ethics. Now this sounds bad to people initially, but if you think about it, it actually makes sense. What Kant is reminding us is that the future is contingent. It's unwritten. We have no idea what the future holds. So why should we allow what might happen, but might just as easily not happen, prevent us from doing what we know to be right? We should simply obey our moral duty, and whatever happens, happens. If we go back to the example of that scruffy beggar, the landlord might think, well, I better let him come in for the night and have this room, because if I don't, well, maybe he's going to go out into the street and get set upon by people and attacked, maybe even killed. If I don't let him in, maybe he's going to go out there and freeze to death. And so because of fear of what might happen, the landlord does the morally wrong thing, which is letting him have the room for less. For all we know, by letting him have that room, this landlord might have done something very bad. Because, yeah, the guy's off the street for the night, but maybe had he been out there, somebody would have come along that was looking for someone just like him. Maybe could have offered him meaningful employment. Maybe he could have done something that would have bettered himself for the rest of his life, rather than just for this one night. We simply don't know what the future holds. So don't worry about the consequences, because you can't know what they're going to be. You can guess, but you don't know for sure. You're better off, Kant says, just to obey the moral duty. And whatever happens, happens. The third proposition says duty is respect for the law. And when Kant says duty is respect for the law, he's not talking about any particular law. He's talking about the concept of law in general. Without a basic respect for the concept of law, no society could survive. If we all went onto the freeway, for example, and did whatever we wanted to, it would be chaos, anarchy. There would be huge amounts of fatalities. Now we know that sometimes people do violate the law, but most people are going to follow it. So we have this basic belief that when we get on the freeway, that we're all going to get on going the right direction, that we're all going to go something that at least approximates the speed limit. Yeah, once in a while you have the drunk idiot that goes the wrong direction. You have the person that thinks it's the Autobahn and wants to go 120. That happens. But most people follow at least an approximation of the rules on the freeway, and that gives us an element of safety and security to be able to live our lives. But Kant is aware, very aware, that not all laws are good laws. And so he draws a distinction here between the juridical law and the moral law. The juridical law is the law of man. It's what's given to us by a king, a parliament, a town council, whatever. The moral law is the law of God or the law of nature, depending upon which language you prefer. Ideally, the juridical law should be written in such a way that it models itself after the moral law. But frequently this doesn't happen. The moral law talks about things like preservation of life. It recognizes a lot of absolutes. But the juridical law is manipulated by people to act in the way that it wants to act. There are some examples up there on the screen. You have some signs from apartheid South Africa. You have some images of slavery. You have an image of Jews hiding in a cramped attic, hiding from the Nazis. You know, apartheid, Nazism, slavery, all of these things were considered acceptable under the law. Juridical law said this is right. And the juridical law said you treat people differently. This rule for this group and that rule for that group. That's what Kant is rebelling against. That's what he's reacting against. The Prussian government during his lifetime was one of the most intense police states that Europe had ever seen. And Kant wrote several pieces against the Prussian government. So he's well aware of the corruptions that human beings make within the juridical law. And that's why he urges us that if there's a conflict between the two, we need to follow the moral law. The moral law is always higher. But how do we know what the moral law is? Well, he says we all have that same rational capacity. What we need to be taught is how to use it. And so he gives us what's known as the categorical imperative. He says there's one and only one categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it become a universal law of nature. Having said that, he then goes on to list several different formulations of the imperative. The first one, which is really very, very similar to this one, I refer to as the imperative of universality. Act as if the maxim of your action were by your will to become a universal law of nature. The basic idea is this. When you're deciding what is the morally correct course of action, you have to ask yourself, yes, I know that as a human being possessed of free will, I can do this if I choose to. But I want to know what would be the case if every single person on the planet did what I'm proposing to do. What would happen if everybody did what I'm proposing to do? Because that's what being a universal law means. It means that every individual is going to be able to do the same thing that I'm going to do. They will have a duty to act that way. Will it be beneficial? Will it be harmful? What's the problem with it? That's the imperative of universality. We also have the imperative of respect. Act to treat all individuals as an end and never as a means only. This is Kant's version of the golden rule. Right? Treat other people the way you want to be treated. But Kant feared that people could misapply or abuse that rule. I think part of what led to that was the French writer, the Marquis de Sade, who was very popular during Kant's lifetime. And, the Marquis de Sade is where the term sadism is going to come from. So, if we simply said, treat all people the way you want to be treated, that's fine unless you happen to be a masochist. But that would imply that if you want to be beaten and abused, then that's the way you should treat other people. Kant understood that this was not the meaning of the golden rule. He didn't want people to misapply it, so he rewrites it in this way. Act to treat all individuals as an end and never as a means only, which basically means since you, as a rational person, should want to be treated with respect and dignity, this is the way that you will treat other people. Since you should not want to be used and abused by others in the pursuit of their goals, you shouldn't use and abuse others in the pursuit of yours. So that's the idea of the imperative of respect. So this becomes a simple tool that we can use anytime we have to decide what is the morally right course of action. Ask ourselves first, universality, what would happen if everybody did what I'm proposing to do? And secondly, respect, does it treat all individuals with respect and dignity? Kant gives 4 different examples in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, but I'm just going to look at the first one here. Let's imagine that we've got this guy who is in such a horrible situation that he's contemplating suicide. He wants to take his own life. Now, because he possesses free will, if he wants to take his own life, he certainly can do this. But he wants to know, is it morally right? And Kant would say, well, let's look at it through the categorical imperative. First, what would happen if every single person who found themselves in a state where their mind is clouded, where they feel intense depression, what would happen if everybody who felt in that position simply committed suicide? Well, it would be devastating to society, because everybody at one point or another gets down on their luck. Everybody at one point or another in their life has these bouts of depression. And I would venture to say that everybody at one point or another in their life thinks about the concept of suicide. Maybe it's only a passing thought for most people, but everybody, I think, pretty much wonders what it might be like. But if everybody then acted upon it, there would be virtually nothing left of humanity. So we know it fails right there. It can't be a moral law. If we went on to look at it from the standpoint of the imperative of respect, you are taking away your own life. Is that showing respect? No. That's using, destroying a body for your own personal ends. Right? That body is being used as a means to an end, not as an end in and of itself. In addition, of course, talking about duty, we have duties and obligations not only to ourselves, but also to our families, to our employers, to our society, and committing suicide would deny them that duty being fulfilled. So what we find is that when we run this through the categorical imperative, we find that committing suicide could never become a moral law, which means it's our duty to live on regardless of what the circumstances are. And most of the time when you work through the imperative, you'll find that it ends up being a negative command. And that makes sense because most laws say don't do this. Very few laws say do this. What Kant hopes for is that we can enter what he calls a realm of ends. And this would be the ideal, the perfect utopian moral society. It would be one in which everybody operated from the standpoint of the moral law. And because of the categorical imperative, everyone is a legislator unto themselves. Because once we're taught the categorical imperative and how to use it, we all, in his mind, reason and think in exactly the same way. So if that's the case, we'll all come to the same conclusion as to what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And of course, when we know what's morally right, most people, just as today with the laws, most people will want to follow it, will want to do what's right. So once we become legislators unto ourselves, I make that ruling in this situation, here's what's morally right. And I'm a legislator because it then becomes universally binding upon all individuals. And Kant actually goes so far as to say that the categorical imperative would even be binding upon God itself. That's how absolute it is. So this is our ultimate, our perfect end, the realm of ends. Yeah, over the years, Kant, of course, has become such a prominent and important and well-known figure that you tend to find lots of humorous little anecdotes and stories and bad puns and bad jokes. So I just found this one rather amusing. Thought we'd throw it up there. Says, "I want to stop philosophizing, but I can't." So, of course, most of those are based upon a mispronunciation of his name. It is Kant, not Kant. So, Kant's philosophy, his ethics, does have certain flaws with it. As I mentioned before, there's the fact that a lot of people would argue whether we would all come to the same conclusion or not. Another big problem, though, with Kant is the fact that he never really took into account the fact that sometimes to obey one moral law, you may have to disobey another. And if every moral law is an absolute that is meant to be obeyed at all times, then how do you handle a situation where to obey one rule is to violate another one? He gives us no answer to that.